If you clicked on this video, I just wanted to say thank you and subscribe for some more Red Dead content. This is not stuff that I normally upload, and for some provided context, this series or these types of videos are basically just compilations of videos that are already up on the channel. Just making it easier for people to binge watch everything when it comes to character analysis or breakdowns or deeper looks at relationships from one character to another. Just to make it all easier and more digestible, and to combine the individual videos as more of a complete series as a long form video, so that way you could just put on in the background, go to sleep, go to work, do whatever you need to do. This one here is all tied to Dutch. Now, considering I have quite a few videos in terms of Dutch, I'll probably end up making a part 2 of this, or maybe even a massive 4 or 5 hour long video with every single video that I've ever done focusing on Dutch as a character and his relationships. But for now, this one specifically is tackling the theory on what would have happened if Dutch killed Bronte sooner, or readdressing the topic of Dutch's head trauma or head injury that he suffered during the trolley station job. Why Dutch didn't take advantage of Sadie, who seemed to be primed and ready to be taken advantage of. Yes, I know how that sounds. Not like that. What I mean is her anger, the grief that she suffered from the death of her husband. She seemed to be perfect for Dutch to kind of push in the opposite direction, to use to his benefit. And then, of course, we're readdressing of the initial signs of when Dutch was beginning to turn on Arthur, or how other people have framed it, Arthur beginning to turn on Dutch. Anyways, I'll shut that all up. Thank you so much for watching. There's going to be chapters for each individual video. If you want to jump around, or if you just want to watch this entire thing, it's perfectly fine as well, but enjoy.
Chi sono sti buffoni?
Angelo Bronte, local crime boss in the city of Saint Denis. While considered a major antagonist, you don't run into Angelo Bronte until the beginning of Chapter 4. Dutch, Arthur, and John are brought directly to his doorstep with one burning question in mind.
I said, why did you take his son? We ain't got no problems with you, sir. Nor you with us. But if you want to start one, there's going to be a lot of folks dead in this room before it's done.
A very tense, rude, and frankly curious situation. One that requires us to go a little ways back to understand the full context here. You see, the Van Der Linde gang have been on the run for months now, utilizing various methods to stay ahead of the law-enforcing Pinkerton Detective Agency. Train and bank robberies, supplemented by Strauss's money-lending schemes, provided the foundation of the gang's somewhat consistent income, if there was any they could consider. It's not until they discover the Pinkertons are hot on their trail, and of course, in the aftermath of Dutch, Arthur, and John baptizing the small town of Valentine in bullets, which was a direct result of an unexpected visit by Leviticus Cornwall, that the gang decided to up and move. Pressured by the law, hunted by a man who has the resources and vendetta to make the lives of all the gang members hell, the Van Der Linde gang found it wisest to move deeper into the south. Territory less tamed and harder to be tracked down in. Whether it was purely coincidental or with Dutch giving way to his own bias against Southerners to some degree, the Van Der Linde gang found themselves at the center of a dispute between two families that long predates the gang's arrival. While we can talk about the Grays and Braithwaite's hatred at length, for this video's purpose, the main takeaway is this. Once the gang moved into the area, they quickly positioned themselves where to both families they looked to be working in their interest, coming to one's aid at the detriment of the other, and vice versa. One of the families, the Grays, were officially recognized as a local law here. The area is plagued by a group known as the Lemoyne Raiders, a group made of a bunch of disgruntled Southern Civil War veterans who refused to lay down their arms and return to civilian ways of life. The Grays, hoping to disrupt the group's sustainability, set out to destroy an illegal moonshining operation they're running out in the swamps, an operation that has ties to both the Braithwaites and none other than Angelo Bronte. While on the surface, while doing this, the Van Der Linde gang put themselves in the good graces of the Grays. By dealing some type of blow to the Braithwaites, they indirectly put themselves on Angelo Bronte's radar, as this single event was Angelo Bronte's first exposure, albeit indirectly, to the Van Der Linde gang. While it was eventually the Braithwaites that kidnapped Jack, Bronte could very well have accepted him, not just to scare the gang into submission by flaunting his connections with the intention of undermining the gang's sense of invulnerability, a notion Dutch at the very least must have had, given his displays of anger and wrath at Mrs. Braithwaite and even Bronte himself. But Bronte could have easily used Jack as bait. It's highly unlikely Bronte has many, if any, willing to challenge him within or outside the city of Saint Denis, and that's a concept supported by his clear signs of arrogance and ill manners. It's evident he's a man of wealth and power. It may have just been amusing to him to take some type of look upon the dim-witted savages who are foolish and brave enough to interrupt his operations. It's almost as if Bronte thinks of Dutch and the gang as lowly as Dutch thought of the Braithwaites and Greys. It's an interesting concept to look at, but whatever the real reason for Jack's kidnapping, one question remains here. What would have happened if Bronte called Dutch out on his bluff here?
Why do you take his son?
Excuse me.
I said, why did you take his son? We ain't got no problems with you, sir. Nor you with us. But if you want to start one, there's going to be a lot of folks dead in this room before it's done.
Would there actually have been a shootout right there in Bronte's living room in the heart of Saint-Denis, a city that, as we see you through the natural events of the game, are in Bronte's service to some degree? Assuming anybody would survive at all, who would it be? If you go back and look at every mission with Bronte in it, Bronte has no bare minimum of respect for the mayor of Saint-Denis, the Native Americans, other local politicians, and least of all Dutch and the Van Der Linde gang members. Bronte never passes up any kind of opportunity to insult the gang in his native tongue.
The angry cowboys, you've arrived, and you've washed per la prima volta questo mese, senza dubbio.
This is quite a party you've invited us to.
While that could be a sign of weakness or even fear, I think it's safe to say, given Bronte's own belief of everyone else, it's not fear, but rather a feeling of superiority, especially the Van Der Linde members. It's quite clear that's how he feels, even after a second conversation with Dutch. He mocks, for the second time, Dutch's poor hygiene habits, a backwards way of life involving just ignorantly, quote-unquote, killing people and screwing cows in the countryside.
It'll make you long for the days when you could shoot each other and screw cows out on the open range.
Those sure were the days.
Followed by Bronte insulting the gang's intelligence even further by falsely informing them of supposed large cash stacks at the trolley station, intentionally setting the gang up for a trap. I think this whole interaction is actually very interesting as it is because, well, yes, Bronte considers the gang backward savages, and he does undoubtedly insult them time and again. There's still a level of him seeing some type of usefulness. The first time he met with Arthur, Dutch, and John, he asked for a simple request. Basically, kill a bunch of grave robbers. The initial exchange was so that way they can get Jack back. However, it could have been a small test to see how compliant they were with doing his bidding. With this follow-up interaction, testing the waters to see whether if he can still utilize the gang's efficiency at getting jobs done.
That is Hector Fellows, this self-righteous newspaper man. Maybe you will kill him for me one day.
Well, we're not paid killers as such, not in cold blood anyway.
I did not know you were so particular that you wouldn't help a friend.
Oh, I'm willing to help in any way I can, within reason.
I'm going to pretend to understand what that means.
Taking Dutch's response as a type of insult, this quick exchange could have been what caused Bronte to spring the trolley trap, believing it easier to get rid of them now rather than later. After all, they have gotten involved in his operations before, and when confronted, Dutch twisted words and played victim. Who's to say that it won't happen again? Bronte has no real tangible leverage over the gang to keep them under his control. So, while definitely arrogant, I think it's safe to say Bronte is quite practical, giving us a little bit more insight to his actual character. With that in mind, let's go back to Bronte's living room, where the air is heavy and the tension is thick. Dutch here is not yet too far gone as he is towards the end of the game. He may threaten Bronte and his goons with a shootout, but I don't believe he ever intended to go guns blazing into a city that not only may be deep in Bronte's pockets, but is completely foreign to him and the rest of the Van Der Linde members. Fresh off of lighting the Braithwaite Manor on fire, realizing how close the Pinkertons are, and then given Arthur was robbed by a bunch of kids as soon as he stepped foot into the city, nothing was in Dutch's favor here. The gang is already in an incredibly vulnerable enough position as it is. They just settled down in the old abandoned mansion of Shady Belle, forced to leave out of the mess they caused back in Rhodes, between the Braithwaites and Greys, on top of Jack being missing, compounded by an unexpected visit by the Pinkertons yet again. While Dutch claims the gang needs each other now more than ever on several occasions, I believe this exact moment is probably the most profound out of all of them. As much fun as it would be to run completely wild with all the theories and speculations of what could and couldn't have happened, there is some type of guidelines that we do have to follow here. Out of the three that came to Bronte's house, the only one really allowed to die during a shootout here would be Arthur. That being because Dutch and both John are alive and more or less well during the events of Red Dead Redemption, a game that takes place after the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. Now personally, I think it'd be way too premature for Rockstar to kill off Arthur here in this shootout, so I think it's safe to say that none of the three would die. But there are some outcomes that we can consider here, one of which would be if Rockstar chooses choose to keep the way the relationships deteriorate, but not through the same events that are already existing in the game. And what I mean by this is we see through the natural progression of the game, Dutch actually starts to slowly alienate John more and more. It was claimed Dutch let John get captured during the bank robbery of Saint Denis, an accusation that was further supported by his obvious lack of enthusiasm to rescue him from Sisika Penitentiary.
John! What are you doing here?
Good to see you too, partner.
I meant I hadn't sent for you yet.
And then him at least appearing to intentionally leave John to die at the very end of the game during the Our Best Selves mission. Considering ending the game here from Arthur's perspective would be pretty premature, as I was saying, and Dutch and John both live in the original game, I don't think any of them would be allowed to die here. And while technically through the natural progression of the game's events, if you really put Dutch and John's relationship under a microscope, there are some instances that if there was a shootout here in Bronte's living room, those other small moments of disrespect in Dutch's eyes would have never happened. But I do believe if a shootout here in Bronte's living room went down, this would have been the first step in a deteriorating relationship, at the very least between Dutch and John. If not immediately injured here in this confined room, I still think Rockstar would have made John the one that got injured, or separated from Arthur and Dutch on their way trying to escape back to the rest of the Van Der Linde gang. I believe Dutch and Arthur undoubtedly would have returned, with John falling behind, with no clear indication on whether if he was captured or killed. The only understanding is they quote-unquote lost John, who would then understandably make Abigail distraught. I would believe Abigail and Arthur would take that the hardest. I think in this case with jacking out John lost to the criminal mogul Bronte, the gang would cut their losses and just move yet again. They're too close to the city they just shot up on their first day arriving in, but also they attempted to kill the man who technically runs the city, a man who they aren't entirely sure survived or not. I think unless Rockstar was to show Bronte actually get killed on screen, I think they would have left it open to interpretation for the rest of the gang, because by doing so provides an interesting dilemma. They don't know if John survived, and they don't know if Bronte survived, with Bronte being a man who clearly exhibits a willingness to hold a grudge against anyone who even looks in his direction without his permission, least of all three smelly savages that disgraced his home with their foul smell and dirtied the floor with the blood of his own men. Whether Bronte survives or not, I believe in the events of the shootout here, the gang really has to decide whether if it's worth taking that risk in sending what they would consider to be quote-unquote their best men to try and rescue John, who again they don't even know was killed or not, while leaving the already vulnerable gang in a worse position should there be a follow-up attack from the Lemoyne Raiders or even from the Pinkertons themselves. Which is why I say ultimately I think the gang would have said fuck it, cut their losses, and just moved on, which would have caused a bigger rift between Abigail and Dutch, or Abigail and the rest of the gang's leadership. If they were to go this route, there's a chance that Gorma would have never happened, which ultimately would have saved Arthur from having his health decline as rapidly as it did, which ultimately would have kept him as someone who held a stronger position within the gang. As we noticed, as he got sick, people started to question his ability and really undermine his position, ultimately mocking his health. I don't think even if he didn't have his health decline as rapidly, I still think he would have definitely saved John, because in the natural course of the events of the game, even though he just found out that he was sick and how badly sick he was, him and Sadie were already planning a rescue mission of some type for John. I also think by them completely removing Guarma, how close Dutch and ultimately Micah got. Like I said in a previous video, there is no on-screen representation of how close Micah and Dutch got during the chapter of Guarma. However, Guarma is the tipping point seemingly for Dutch, where once he comes back, he's much more unhinged, he's a lot more reckless, and his mentality gravitates more towards what Micah is usually catering to, what Micah likes to normally do. It actually even brings up the question of whether, if Rockstar went this route where yes, there was a falling out with Abigail, Jack, and John due to Dutch's seemingly much more logical reasoning here, and then coupled with the fact that Hosea in this scenario is still alive, being Dutch's own voice of reason, I doubt the gang would have descended into as much chaos as it eventually does. But I do think this would have been a good opportunity for Rockstar to kind of flip the narrative on its head, where this was the point where the gang fell out with John, or even Micah could still be in Dutch's ear behind the scenes, being much more compliant and less bold, with Arthur not being as visibly sick, and with Hosea actually being much more present and maybe even more active in what's going on. I think Micah definitely would have bended Dutch's ear behind the scenes. At the very beginning of the game, Dutch starts making comments about how Arthur and Hosea are doubting him. Towards the end of the game, we see that sentiment really being hammered home in Dutch's mind, undoubtedly thanks to Micah pushing that narrative and supporting that mentality. So I think behind the scenes, the seeds for that mentality were already being set. I think Micah would have been in Dutch's ear. I think Dutch would have slowly isolated Hosea, or at least not pay as much attention or hold as much importance or significance to the words that he said. Cut Jack loose, cut John loose, and continued about their business. Arthur, Sadie, and possibly with Hosea's blessing, would have mounted some type of rescue for John once they caught wind that he was in fact alive, and I think events would have followed a similar natural progression of Dutch questioning whose loyalty lies where. I mean, obviously, it's all speculation. I want to know what you think. I thought this was an interesting video because I was replaying the game and I just remembered Dutch's particular facial expression and how angry he got, and I was wondering what would have been the case if he didn't submit to Bronte in this room and he continued with that bravado.
Ruined my life!
Sadie Adler, vengeance personified. I don't think I have to say Sadie is easily one of the most interesting characters in this game. I think most people just agree with that. Once a married, law-abiding citizen, her life was turned upside down in the blink of an eye, with her husband and home being stripped from her. Everything that symbolized her as being a domesticated, loving person was all gone, completely vanishing the day she rode off with the Van Der Linde gang. While I always found Sadie's transformation fascinating, with her fits and episodes of rage putting anything Micah's ever done to shame, as times went on, I've come to really appreciate the way Rockstar's handled telling her story. Traumatized, she's completely absent from Horseshoe Overlook. Clemens Point shows her frustration from standing idly by inside the camp, dictated no more than to just be Pearson's help. A man she evidently has a massive amount of disrespect towards.
Boring. Ooh. Wait a sec. Listen to this. Since we last corresponded, I have traveled widely, making no small name for myself. Before you ask, I am still yet to take a wife, but I can assure you it's not for a lack of suitors. You ever actually even talk to a woman he ain't paid for?
Oh, look.
Or if not, disrespect, finds herself as more of his superior rather than even an equal. We get a small glimpse of things the new Sadie's willing and capable of doing. However, at this point in time, it's no more than what appears to be an enthusiastic fascination with a new outlaw lifestyle she's adopted.
So, what's the plan? I shoot the shopkeeper while you...
No, you insane?
I thought we was outlaws.
It's not until the gang relocates to Shady Belle and is under attack by the O'Driscolls where her anger, rage, and request for blood payment by them is finally able to be satiated.
Sadie? Sadie! Sadie! Why didn't you get inside?
And miss all this?
This is the first time Arthur actually witnesses this type of behavior by her. And given he's still referring to her as Mrs. Adler here, they're obviously not as close as they come to be in the later portion of the game, but it's actually this singular instance that I want to talk a little bit more about because Rockstar never puts too much of an emphasis on Sadie. How she's doing, or how she's starting to hit a breaking point, wanting so desperately to move on from her grief that she's carrying, is never put in front of you until it's already there, and it becomes an issue where Arthur and other members basically have to start acknowledging it. This display of her anger and rage holding off so many O'Driscolls in an attack isn't just impressive, it shows that anyone is willing and capable of doing a complete 180 like Sadie did. She's the only member in the entire game where she starts off, for lack of a better word here, pure. She isn't already accustomed to this outlaw lifestyle. Instead, she's pulled into it and eventually fully embraces it. While on the outside we all see an evolution of someone who settled down, had a husband, some land and a house, descended to the deepest depression fathomable, only to rise out of it anger and vengeful, and really reborn. She doesn't descend straight into an aimless bloodlust though. She still has moments of breaking down, almost at times it sounds as if she hates the life she leads now.
They turned me into a monster, Arthur. But my memories of him, they still pure.
She's not unaware or even chooses to shift blame, looking for an excuse to cover up her actions. Instead, it's almost as if she carries this anger to get even with Colm and the rest of the O'Driscolls to avenge her dead husband, a revenge mission that almost transitions into a guilt and sadness. guilt for living when her husband didn't, and sadness for the bitter, nihilistic person she's become. Although that more so describes her during the epilogue chapters, I always wondered why Dutch didn't exploit her rage and anger so much. There's only one time where it came off as if he did. That was during the mission Goodbye Dear Friend, where we get to see Colm O'Driscoll hang. With the O'Driscolls and Van Der Linde gang raging wars for years, it would only seem right to bring someone that's been with the gang for a longer period of time, such as John, Bill, Javier, hell, maybe even Charles. Although given Charles's involvement with the natives' plight against US military, and Charles somewhat being in direct opposition against Dutch's attempts to utilize the natives more so as a distraction rather than actually helping them, not using Charles makes a bit more sense as he'd be busy elsewhere. And Dutch could very well be annoyed with his recent attempts to help the natives, and see that more as getting in the way and betraying him. Sadie, on the other hand, time and again has been known to be more of a loose cannon. Arthur's made it known himself that she more or less practically scares him. Taking Sadie here would undoubtedly have negative consequences. I fully believe Dutch saw this outburst of Sadie as a real possibility and still chose to take her, giving into more of his own personal demons. If Sadie erupted into her usual fits of rage, Dutch would have to fight his way out of Saint Denis with Sadie and Arthur now. But if it was a bloodbath Dutch was really after, why not bring Micah? Wouldn't it be wiser to bring his new favorite? A man who would always jump at any chance to add another tally to his revolver's names while pleasing his new master? Perhaps. Or maybe this was a ploy by Dutch to see where Sadie's own loyalty lies. Maybe she could be as devoted to him and only him as Micah is. By bringing her along, he could have also tried to test the waters, maybe even try to pull her away from Arthur. With the exception of John, Sadie's the only one right by Arthur's side during the events of Beaver Hollow. She was crucial with John's rescue from Sitka Penitentiary, scouting the island for John's schedule for work in the field, and going guns blazing with Arthur onto the island. She's also proven to be aggressive, reliable, and willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done. On top of all of this, she doesn't shy away from taking charge. Prime example is when the failed robbery of the Saint Denis Bank happened. She was the one that basically took over command of the gang and ensured everyone's survival in the absence of Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur. Arthur's health is clearly deteriorating rapidly. How useful was her services to a man whose days are numbered? Well, it's difficult to really say what the stance is of Dutch or even Micah, as there isn't much direct communication between Micah and Sadie, or even Dutch and Sadie during the main events of the game. What we can say is, to her core, despite moments of completely losing herself and making sure everyone around her feels the anger and rage, a manifestation of the mourning of everything that she's lost, what we can see is through Beaver Hollow, and ultimately even through the epilogue and seeing how Sadie acts towards Abigail and John, is that even though she fully embraced this outlaw lifestyle, even though she did a complete 180 and she is taking lives left and right, and she has this more pessimistic approach to life in general, she still hasn't completely lost herself. She still has that soft spot for Arthur. She even praises him as being a good man. She sticks her neck out for ensuring John makes it safely back to Abigail. She even eventually offers John a job, a nice steady income that she guarantees Abigail is safe. Well, I think we'd be diving a little too deep into theoretical and hypothetical territory if I start saying Dutch saw Sadie as any type of a threat or a real rival. I don't think that's possible at all. At the very least, he definitely acknowledged how useful she can be. And it's just crazy to think what would have happened if he really tailored, or even Micah really tailored more towards that aggressive side in her, and she took a much proactive role with Dutch and Micah right behind her. Or even if she adopted that naive enthusiasm that we see her portray in the very stages of Clement's Point when they venture into Rhodes and she talks about shooting shopkeepers and doing whatever outlaws do, with their mind being such fertile ground. What would have happened if Micah came, bent that ear a little bit, brought her on a couple heists and robberies and showed her how he handles things? How much would that have influenced her and altered the events of Beaver Hollow and the end of the game? Ultimately, the bottom line is Sadie is a good woman, even though she became a little bit bloodthirsty towards the end and adopted a life that she never would have imagined for herself in a million years. And it's kind of insane to think of all the events and all the things that would have been drastically differently if Dutch and Micah seen the potential this woman really had. How big of a role did Dutch's head injury and subsequent concussion play in his increasingly erratic behavior? Today, that's the very question we are going to be exploring, taking a deep dive into the actions of the gang and Dutch prior to and after the events of the trolley station job, and analyzing how much potential damage this head trauma did to Dutch's psyche. Let's start at this incident itself. The trolley station is sound and he's getting ready to be robbed. Dutch and Lenny wait around the corner from it, expecting to rendezvous with Arthur. Dutch, acting on fresh information provided by Angela Bronte just a few days prior, says with this money, he can find a ship captain ready to take them to the island of Tahiti. They just need to procure enough funds this trolley station is going to supply.
Born.
Well, where the hell is Tahiti?
South Pacific, an untouched paradise.
Who lives there?
Tahitians, I guess.
We made a bit of money on that riverboat job, but not enough for us to leave and live peacefully. Where's the rest coming from?
In there.
As we all know, this trolley station was a trap, set up by Angela Bronte, who possibly foresaw the Van Der Linde gang as a potential threat to, if not his personal well-being, then to the operations he had his hands in. And this was him setting bait for the gang to take, which they inevitably did. This was the catalyst that in some ways sealed the fate of Bronte, possibly even Hosea, and with it the tiny remnants of whatever Dutch's mental state was. Now if we look at that opening cutscene of the trio trying to get away in the trolley, it derails, sending the occupants flying around, resulting in Dutch's face getting bruised and hitting his head, as we seen by him holding it as he struggles to get up from the floor. Head injuries are not something to easily dismiss. They can result in permanent damage and lifelong complications, especially if left untreated. Obviously, as the game continues, there's never any signs of Dutch receiving any kind of treatment for this injury. On the flip side, can we really say it is that serious of one? Considering Dutch doesn't immediately black out or lose consciousness, he doesn't appear to be any more disoriented or confused than Arthur and Lenny. None of them, especially Dutch, displays any blurred vision or speech or difficulty walking. I mean, unless the injury had some serious delayed reaction that took effect over the next few days, just observing his immediate behavior after the crash, he for the most part seemed okay. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any consequences to hitting his head. Other symptoms to even a concussion besides the one I already mentioned can be fatigue, irritability, memory loss, behavior changes, and overall mood changes. I remember someone saying they believe Dutch is bipolar as he swings from an unbelievably high level of hope and optimism for the future, only to swing back around in brutal anger or appear down at his or the gang's current situation. This can easily be explained by Dutch's head trauma, definitely explaining his dramatic mood swings. However, I don't think it explains his killing of Bronte and his loosening grip of reality. Now, before I say this, let's make this perfectly clear. I'm not saying the head trauma that he sustains has nothing to do with it. I think it definitely exacerbates an already bad situation, making it 10 times worse. However, it's not an isolated incident that caused him to act out of character and wanting to kill Bronte. I think it contributes to an already complex behavior pattern that Dutch was already showing. Let's tackle this one by one, starting with fatigue and Dutch suffering behavior changes. The mission right before the trolley station job showed Shady Belle was just attacked by the O'Driscolls, with Kieran sent back to the camp in a horrifying way. He was decapitated, his eyes gouged out, and his head was presented by his body that was riding horseback. The Pinkertons are close by.
This place ain't no such thing as civilized. It's man, so in love with greed, he has forgotten himself and found only appetites.
And Dutch has already suffered the personal frustration of losing money and having to run to a different camp at least 3 times now. His quote-unquote plan that he wants everyone to believe in is already hanging by a thread, with the more independent members such as John, Hosea, and Arthur questioning Dutch's decision-making and ability to lead them to the paradise he talks so highly of. Dutch, prior to the trolley job, had to already have some level of fatigue, anger, and paranoia. Paranoia that those directly underneath him do not have the blind loyalty to him, which is something he absolutely demands. And he makes comments about this in every chapter, directly in cutscenes or even through in-camp dialogue. At the start of the trolley job, he even sounds almost desperate to make Arthur and Lenny believe this job was crucial for him to make sure they can all escape clean.
Keep walking. You're late.
Couple of days in this place, you turned into some clock-watching city boy. What's the urgency?
We need to leave. Forever. We've been doing well, making money, but for us all to leave together, we need enough for a boat. Now, I found a friendly ship captain. He's willing to take us to Australia or Tahiti.
I don't doubt for a second Dutch was under a lot of stress and, as Arthur just said, a strong sense of urgency. This was already in place prior to Dutch's head bump. The next glaringly obvious issue is behavior changes. Dutch's quest for revenge on Angelo Bronte is unprecedented up to that point. I mentioned in a previous video on how Arthur acknowledged Dutch's anger towards Bronte for this betrayal. Arthur in his journal writes he doesn't see Dutch letting Bronte get away with the setup, and Dutch was so angry that even Micah stood clear of the issue, refusing to entertain it. When Dutch presents the idea of taking Bronte out to Hosea, he claims it's something that has to be done. The gang is preparing to rob the Bank of Saint Denis. Saint Denis is a city Bronte runs, and as a result, he wouldn't let the gang get away with the robbery. Better to save the potential headache that he'll cause by just taking him out now. Dutch is rational in his thinking here, at least enough to win over Arthur.
To take revenge, we hardly know the guy.
This ain't about revenge, Hosea. Angelo Bronte don't mean shit to me. This is about the fact we are planning to rob a bank in his town. A bank that he no doubt protects. A town where his men are gunning for us.
It's his ability to rationalize here that tells me it's less of a direct symptom of a head injury and more of the injury and possibly even countless insults Bronte hurled at Dutch and the gang members in the many times they were in his presence, with there even being a moment where Bronte directly calls out Dutch for longing for the days where you can shoot each other and screw cows out in the open range.
It'll make you long for the days when you could shoot each other and screw cows out on the open range.
Those sure were the days.
Or the number of times Bronte commented on their lack of bathing or inability to understand complex topics, insulting their hygiene and intelligence. That ultimately just compounded to him harboring this unbearable rage towards Bronte. Dutch got injured, was almost killed, suffered insult after insult at this man, a man that felt so superior to Dutch, a person who's narcissistic himself, someone who sees himself as a modern day Wild West Robin Hood, who steals from the rich and gives to the less fortunate. And now, similar to what he did back in Blackwater, what he's going to do in the future on the island of Gorma and in Annisburg with Leviticus Cornwall, Bronte here and now has to pay with his life in order for the gang to survive. And that's the crucial element right there. In this context, it almost makes you wonder what he means by gang, especially since the gang is named after him and they all follow his will. But it appears even before Bronte, Dutch had it in him to take the life of someone under the guise of gang preservation. There's no way an injury that didn't knock him unconscious or left him bedridden for a few days would completely derail his character. I think the days following the trolley job gave him ample time to think and brood over the last insult Bronte gave him, displaying very clearly how little he thought of Dutch, and he never lost his ability to rationalize for members who needed some type of convincing. Really the only person being Hosea, whose death led to Dutch giving up on trying even more. Why try to convince people when you know you're charismatic and can give them exactly what they want and need, so long as they listen to you? Dutch's mask, or maybe even wholehearted attempt to try to be something he possibly may have always wanted to be, a kind, charismatic, loving leader who never killed unless he absolutely needed to, was starting to wear thin. Or maybe deep down, he was the very thing men like Bronte and Milton identified him as, a cold-blooded savage, and out of resentment of everything those men represented, he tried his best to subvert from his natural behavior, only for it all to completely fall apart. While Dutch's behavior and true intentions may always be up for debate, I do not believe this was the single cause of his degrading mentality. I believe this happened long ago, and each incident after only worsening the situation. I do agree, I think he severely hurt his head, but not enough to alter his core personality, his core traits, or even his train of thought. I think it just took out the reason for him to care, or to critically think of the repercussions his actions might bring down upon himself or the other gang members. I think a bigger question to raise wouldn't be how much damage this head trauma caused to his mentality and how much it affected the rest of the game, because like I said, I think that was always there. It just exacerbated and expedited his slipping quote-unquote grasp on reality. The bigger question I think would be, was this how he always was and just needed that validation? Or was this just a mentality and a stance that he adopted slowly over time? Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Like always, wanted to thank you so much for watching, especially if you stayed all the way to the end of the video. I greatly appreciate it. If you want to talk more Red Dead Redemption 2 or throw a video idea my way, feel free to leave it down in the comments below, or even join the Discord. There's a link down in the description to a public server with roughly 3,000 members, so if you want to talk, chat, contact me directly, that's a great way to do so, or follow me on my socials. That's always in the description as well. But till the next video, see y'all later.
Well, I'm afraid I have to insist. I mean, we gotta let them go, because if the Pinkertons come through again, they will kill everyone.
John? Insist?
This is a clip from the beginning of Our Best Selves, pretty much the very last mission of the Beaver Hollow chapter when the entire gang goes downhill. This interaction between Arthur and Dutch is one that has always stuck with me. It displays Dutch at the end of his rope, his silence and slowly repeating back to Arthur what he just heard in a matter of complete shock and disbelief, a moment of utter realization that Arthur doesn't have his back. Arthur may actually be against him and his wishes, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Whether if that is true or not, one thing is certain. In this moment, it's clear something has changed within Dutch, no longer hiding his anger or disbelief behind a show of charisma and dream-filled words. The camp is now empty. The hopeful years of the Van Der Linde gang are long gone, and with it the benefit or really ability by Dutch to try to save face. There's no reason to try to do so for the remaining members that are around. Instead, better to alleviate the woes of the person who upset him by calming any anxiety or opposition by appearing to politely agree with them, as he does here with Arthur, giving in to his request.
Of course, pal. Whatever you think is best, I will see to it. Huh? Now, we gonna rob a train?
Only to reveal the anger and rage Arthur accidentally stirred up within him a few moments later.
He insists upon it. Insists.
This goes to show not just how unhinged Dutch has become, but possibly even provide some insight as to how Dutch may have always handled people who were in his way that were supposed to be on his side. People that are supposed to be fighting for him in his vision. Those meant to be within his camp are actually, in his mind, obstacles. Obstacles that may have slowly and quietly been taken out when the time was right. But with the camp now empty, Arthur sick, and the unwavering loyalty of Javier, Bill, Micah, and Micah's men, there's no longer any need for subtlety. But it's important to keep in mind that this is not an isolated incident here. There have been moments all throughout Beaver Hollow where Dutch has insulted Arthur.
Well, Arthur needs to rest.
Cut him out of important decision making. Question Arthur's failing health as a way to invalidate reasonable worries Arthur's raised towards Dutch and the direction he's headed in.
But first we have to make a whole lot of smoke, a whole lot of commotion. And then we disappear.
We need more commotion.
1 score and 1 whole hell of a lot of noise.
We ain't so good at doing scores anymore, Dutch.
Are you feeling all right, Arthur?
When considering the various instances where Dutch insults and speaks in a disparaging tone to Arthur throughout Beaver Hollow, all clear signs of his declining mental state supplemented with the type of loyalty that is constantly being redefined by his current situation, it kind of makes you wonder, where did it all go wrong exactly? When and where is Arthur's fall from Dutch's good graces? Is there even one particular moment that we can call out, or is it a series of events compounded by the tragedy of Hosea's death, Dutch's right-hand man and closest friend within the gang, followed up by being stranded on the island of Guarma and thrown into a situation that seems to be constantly spiraling out of his control. And control, as we see, is something that Dutch absolutely requires. And because of this, maybe the smallest form of opposition, something as harmless and as innocent as a question about particular members, could appear as doubting, could appear as opposition. I'm sure we're all aware that pretty much all throughout the game, from chapters 1 to 3, Dutch makes comments referring to Arthur not having faith, Arthur not believing in him. And as early as the chapter of Coulter, on their way to Horseshoe Overlook, Dutch says that Arthur can ride with Hosea and the two of them can talk about the good old days and what's gone wrong with good old Dutch.
You're in that one. Bring Hosea. I know you two like to talk about the good old days and what's gone wrong with old Dutch.
At this point in time, and even in the subsequent chapters, it's always said in such a harmless way that it flies over everybody's head. It's not until hindsight kicks in so much later that these comments appear to be a little bit more menacing in nature, but for the moment it's more of an innocent acknowledgement by Dutch of their disappointment rather than a warning or any kind of blatant sign of opposition towards him. This is as simple as him just saying, hey, I know you guys doubt the current situation, but I know you're not doubting me, right? He still has the very thing he wants from them, and at that point in time it was blind, unwavering loyalty. After combing over so many of the main missions spanning from Horseshoe Overlook to the days of Beaver Hollow, we see Dutch in various stages. Horseshoe Overlook, we find Dutch in a state where he's much more level-headed, trying more so to keep the gang together with no overt signs of aggression. Here at this point in time, he is seen more as a silver-tongued leader. There's no need to get his hands dirty or really any intention to do so. He's more preoccupied with actually practicing his own teachings and trying to get enough money so that way they can continue to move on into a land that's much more, in their words, free. Heading into Clement's point, he's much more aggressive with taking advantage of the locals, leading the initiative, ensuring the gang ingratiates themselves with the Greys, and the chapter's topped off with Hosea and Dutch showing more aggressive, vindictive tendencies than they have before.
You want me to kill you too, old woman?
You bastards!
Where's the boy?
We have lived in this house for 120 years. We never had no problems except for
Where
Yankees.
is the boy? Who took him?
You killed my son!
Oh, and I will surely kill the rest of them unless you start talking.
Oh, I know your type.
But with the exception of handling Jack's kidnapping and Dutch reluctantly meeting with Colm, Dutch I think is seen as much more energetic and calculated in this chapter than any other chapter in the game. It's not until the chapter Shady Belle and the gang gets involved with the locals and politics of Saint Denis that things start to appear to be much worse. When we move into the chapter of Shady Belle, not just Dutch, but even Arthur's very reluctant. They aren't fans of this city. Arthur, Dutch, and John particularly already have an objective that they're not even particularly looking forward to, and that's the safe return to Jack. They don't know what they're exactly walking into. After meeting Angela Bronte, though, there's still so much hope within Dutch. It's almost as if the position, the mentality that Dutch adopted within the chapter of Rhodes is still being continued here. He takes the initiative of trying to work with Angela Bronte, looking for leads or any other jobs that he and the other gang members can exploit. There's talk of a trolley station, there's talks of a bank, there's talks of a ferry job. He doesn't take the back seat, the silver-tongued, charismatic leader that he was during the events of Horseshoe Overlook. He's much more front and center, similar to how he was during the chapter of Rhodes, but he's still not quite showing anger or being incapable of his own actions. It's not until one particular event that it all starts going downhill, and that is the trolley job. The trolley station, as we all know, was ultimately a trap set by Angela Bronte. This was a singular catalyst that I think was the moment where Dutch started to really show his true colors. If we look at the order of missions right before the trolley station job, Shady Belle was actually attacked by the O'Driscolls. And there's a moment at the end of the mission where there's an exchange between Arthur and Dutch that I think is noteworthy.
Scrimshaw!
Already taking care of it. Come on now, work.
Colm O'Driscoll. That man can really hate.
So can I, Arthur. So can I. We need to get moving.
Without a doubt, a foreshadowing of events to come. However, in the moment, it looks like Dutch is alluding to this anger and rage being taken out on Colm, when in fact, it happens to be taken out on Bronte. The death of Angela Bronte is going to be an event that's always going to be cited because it plays such a crucial role. Not just for the fact that Dutch kills someone in cold blood, and it's not just for the fact that he does it in such a brutal way by feeding his corpse to alligators, and of course doing it in front of practically everybody, including Arthur and John, two of the members that arguably idolize Dutch in a way that no other member really does. It's incredible to think how major of an event this was, and just the display of the brutality here that completely destroyed his image, showed how unhinged, how uncontrollable his rage can be at times, but also there's an important source that we need to look into here. During the killing of Angela Bronte, it looks like Dutch is angry in the moment because he remembers the betrayal, and on top of that, leading up to this mission, Dutch's justification for taking out Bronte is because the gang plans on hitting the Saint Denis bank, and with them hitting the bank within Bronte City, Bronte's going to take it personally, and he knows where the gang is. So there's going to be a personal vendetta that's probably going to rival that of even Leviticus Cornwall. Better to take him out before he gets us, Dutch says. However, if we look at Arthur's journal, it appears to be a little bit of a different story. Writing about these events, Arthur says, "Seems those of us who thought Angelo Bronte was a lizard in a suit was right, and them as thought he was a gentleman thief eager to help us on our merry way was wrong. Bastard sent us into a trap in town. Told us to rob a trolley station. No money, but the entire police force waiting for us. Dutch nearly died. Lenny fought real hard. The kid is good in a fight, and saved us. Dutch is planning some big escape for us all, some grand master plan. Everything we are attempting here seems troubled. I hope we can get out of here alive." Then he goes on with, "Right now, it don't seem likely. Dutch is raging about Bronte's deception or betrayal or whatever quite it was. Dutch don't like being made a fool of. Even Micah, with all his teasing and nettling, plays it real cool with Dutch. I would not want to be Bronte right now. I cannot see Dutch letting this pass. After reading that passage, hearing Micah himself was trading eggshells around Dutch just goes to show that this was a unique situation, a unique circumstance. That was one that was very volatile, and Dutch took very personally. While this may not have been the instance where Arthur fell out of good graces within Dutch, I think this is a moment where Arthur at least acknowledged that there's something deeper within Dutch that other people had not quite seen yet. Something that was put on full display the moment that Bronte was finally killed. The next entry into Arthur's journal talks about him doubting Dutch, not in his ability to keep his head together, but more so in his plan, in his ability in actually seeing the vision and seeing where he wants himself and the gang to ultimately be. Well, it's not Arthur that's the most vocal during the killing of Bronte, but in fact John. It might seem like this is a little bit of an insignificant event to really recall upon to say is the catalyst, but if you were to look at the main cutscenes across the story, there's no real rift between Arthur and Dutch until Gorma. The next biggest instance, obviously with the exception of Bronte, is when Dutch kills the old lady in cold blood in the island of Gorma when she demands more money, and Dutch yet again kills her under the guise that she was going to turn them in. And while this subsequent interaction between Arthur and Dutch is incredibly tense, it's almost as if there's a menacing tone underneath Dutch where he just wants Arthur to believe him. There's still no falling out. There's still no exact rift. I wanted to present the information provided by Arthur's journal because I found it crucial to at least identify that within Arthur there's an inkling that there's something deeper, much more menacing, quite intimidating within Dutch that even Micah wasn't willing to touch with a 10-foot pole. He stood very clear of that, it sounded like. And you gotta be in a world of hurt if even Micah's willing to acknowledge that this is a very fragile situation that he doesn't want to exacerbate. And while Gorma happens, there are some disagreements between Arthur and Dutch. There's still no instance where Dutch starts to at least distrust Arthur or be dismissive of him. While at odds within Gorma, there's no standoff moments. It's not until they return from Gorma that Dutch dismisses Arthur for the first time. And it's in this same interaction that Dutch even replaces Micah with Arthur by giving him the position of planning the gang's future.
We need more money. We've been on the run for months now, and I seen you killing folk in cold blood like you always told me not to, and I'm sorry, but I can't help but think that if we
There is country in Roanoke Ridge past Butcher Creek I believe we could hold.
Okay.
You and Charles, you can take folks up that way. Micah and I need to do some reconnaissance. I ain't got a final plan yet. Arthur, I ain't got it. I just need time.
Dismissed and forced to shut up by his superior. This entire interaction is crucial because it starts off with Dutch mentioning his next grand chess move, the next major robbery to set the gang up so that way they can just disappear. Arthur, on the other hand, wants to hear none of it. He talks about his primary concern being the women, a concern that Dutch goes on to liken to Hosea, reminiscing of how much he misses him. This leads to Dutch asking Arthur what he believes they should do, followed by Arthur mentioning they can't stay here, and then going on to discuss the many instances that Dutch has acted out of character by killing in cold blood. Frustrated and wanting to hear none of this, Dutch shuts him down, sending him on an errand with Charles to go clear out some land for the rest of the gang, so that way he and Micah can plan their next move. Perhaps even intentionally sending away anybody that would oppose him or Micah so that they can have the peace and quiet to plan whatever they want. It's also important to keep in mind how Dutch ends this conversation.
I need time and no traitors.
When you look at how he shuts Arthur down, not wanting to hear any of his transgressions, breaking his own code, killing people in cold blood, and then dismissing Arthur in such a way, alluding to him towing that line of being a traitor, this has to be the very first instance where the two of them actually butt heads. This is even the first time where Arthur directly calls out Dutch in such an aggressive way. This is before Arthur is aware of his sickness and how far along his tuberculosis truly is, and he's not quite hitting that point where he's so reflective and remorseful of his actions and the life that he's lived. The seemingly useless, depressive position he takes towards the later events of Beaver Hollow, he's not quite there yet. And even this interaction between the two of them, it doesn't show him and Dutch being at odds quite yet. Sure, Dutch is a little upset, sure, Dutch is dismissive here and even implies that Arthur better think twice about his actions and things that he's saying, but it's not until Arthur goes behind Dutch's back and saves John from behind the walls of Sisika Penitentiary. I believe this is the next significant nail in the coffin between the two of them because on the surface, when you watch the mission, Dutch is very visibly upset with Arthur.
And
When Springin' John brings the law down on all of us, what then, Arthur?
Well, I guess we'll have another fight on our hands.
Loyalty, Arthur, it ain't. I had a goddamn plan!
I've talked a little bit about this in a previous video, but ultimately, Dutch is rightfully upset on the surface because the gang is not in a position where they can fight off the Pinkertons or any other law enforcement that might be coming to take John back to the penitentiary. And with the lawmen coming to take John back, that'll obviously bring death at the gang's doorstep, something none of them are prepared for. A very fair argument considering the majority of the gunmen have basically just gotten back from the Revolutionary War they got sucked into on the island of Gorma. They're barely settling into the camp at Beaver Hollow. Everybody is just starting to settle down, settle in, and plan their next move, not just individually but collectively. So it would make sense for Dutch to get upset. However, when Dutch starts to talk about this logical argument and then bring up the concept of loyalty again, only to get upset at that he had a plan that Arthur just undermined, it starts to appear that Dutch really just got upset at Arthur deciding to do whatever he wanted to do and not necessarily putting the gang in jeopardy. That issue is second to going behind Dutch's back. At least that's how it's portrayed within this moment right here. And it's almost as if parallel to the whole Angelo Bronte situation where, yes, you do have the argument that you are putting the gang in jeopardy, but it's Dutch's vanity and taking a personal insult to the other person's actions that demand immediate retaliation, that demand an immediate reaction. And if we consult Arthur's journal yet again in terms of this particular event, we get a little bit more insight between how deep this rift really was between the two of them. In Arthur's journal, he writes, Mrs. Adler and me got attacked by Dutch. I went behind his back, sure, and he never liked that, but I suppose the years of blind loyalty is at an end. Loyal, yes, but not blind. Not until he opens his eyes as to the hell we are in and who his friends really are. Micah, I no longer trust whatsoever, nor do I trust half of them, nor myself. The whole thing is a mess, and I cannot think clearly. If we were to put a little bit more value into Arthur's perspective and how he interprets Dutch's actions and how Dutch is processing things, we can draw our own conclusions by what we're seeing within the cutscenes, of course, but when you dive into Arthur's notebook and listen to his inner monologue and his thoughts and everything going on around him, you start to see that Arthur really does have a much better understanding of his adopted father. It's almost similar to what we see go on throughout Beaver Hollow. While Arthur keeps trying to plead to Dutch's rationale, some logical side that hopefully is still there, Arthur continues to make attempts, hoping and praying that Dutch will listen to him and not continue to do all kinds of crazy things, in his words, quote unquote, creating all kinds of noise so that way they can get away, using the Indians as distraction, blowing up a bridge, mounting assaults against the United States Army, or even killing Leviticus Cornwall. It almost echoes the same sentiments here within the journal, where Arthur's aware, on some level, if not of what Dutch is capable and willing to do, at the very least of how Dutch would perceive certain things, certain actions, certain events. Similar to many other events and many other relationships throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, it's hard to say when the exact moment was where Arthur starts to doubt Dutch or Dutch starts to look at Arthur any differently. It's hard to even say whether if Dutch completely gave up on Arthur or not. He does have moments where he dismisses him, he insults him, he even was willing to let him get captured or killed. But he still makes attempts to keep him around or at least try to save face within him. I think the beauty within Red Dead Redemption 2's story ultimately is, just like in this particular video, taking a look at the relationship between Arthur and Dutch and where exactly everything went wrong. There's no particular incident. I think it's just a series of bad decisions, events that went on within Arthur's personal life that involved a major perspective change and him having to take a step back and reevaluate what is and isn't most important within his life. And Beaver Hollow just shows this weird moment where there's behavior conducted by both Arthur and Dutch that neither one of them probably would have ever exhibited if, for Arthur, he wasn't sick, and if for Dutch he didn't witness the death of Hosea, on top of losing all the gold from the Saint Denis Bank, on top of constantly being on the run and the situation endlessly spiraling out of his control. I do believe it's this interaction that first showcases them butt heads, and it's the first time Dutch, on some level, acknowledges that Arthur isn't as blindly faithful to him as he once thought he was. And it was compounded by Arthur going behind his back, rescuing John, and then at every turn continuing to question Dutch, his intentions, his next move, why he's causing so much smoke and so much noise, when in Arthur's perspective, it's better to just lie low. but I'm gonna pass this on to you. When do you think was the exact moment that the two of them fell out? Do you think I'm right? Do you think it was another time, or am I missing something? Let me know down in the comment section below. Like always though, thank you so much for watching. If you have any theories, character analysis, or relationships or anything like that you want to have covered in a future video, by all means feel free to share that down in the comment section. And of course, feel free to join the Discord, where there's around 3,000 members talking about various games. So, and of course you can talk to me directly through that, so feel free to join. Look forward to seeing you there. But like always, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Oh, I got you now, you bastard.
We are all bastards, my friend. But only one of us is some would-be emperor's whore.
We know who you are.
And nobody knows who you are. Not even your goddamn father.
You maggots are going to die.
When a villain is written so well, they can become the face of an entire series. Sometimes accidentally. Sometimes villains are written so well you can't help but at least sympathize with them. Understand the logic, the reason behind what they're doing, what motivates them and compels them to take the actions that they do. Maybe they aren't bad people after all. Perhaps it's because they are the antagonist to our hero's story. Nothing more than an obstacle and irritation for the person we play as. Their morals and values may actually be just and simply based off the perspective we're given. They're the bad guys, and us the heroes of our own story that won't allow them the slightest chance of being seen as remotely good. Other times it's not that complicated. We just hate them for what they have done and are willing to do. Nothing redeemable about them. We ache to see the day they get what's coming to them. The story of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a mixture of the two. We learn to hate people like Milton, Ross, and Cornwall. We can't mistake them for being entirely good. Undoubtedly, Cornwall has his hands in less than savory business dealings. A ruthless businessman to his core. He may not be a villain, at least not in our story, but he wasn't a good man either. Ross was a man that upheld the law, but he was one that refused to believe in reformation, turning around and betraying John, resulting in him taking away 4 lives and not just Marston's. Milton is also somewhat of a fair lawman, but he did order an entire legion of Pinkertons to open fire on a dilapidated shack that he was aware housed women and at least 1 child. Well, we can sit and talk about the many different characters and faces in this game. Today I wanted to address one specifically, one that may be so well known, he may be the inadvertent face of the Red Dead Redemption series. That person, of course, being none other than Dutch Van Der Linde. Dutch in the first Red Dead Redemption game was an outlaw we really knew nothing about. For the most part, we knew he was charismatic, he was the leader of the gang John Marston rode with in his formative years, and we know he was responsible for teaching John how to read and write, telling us as players this man has, or at least had, a soft spot at some point in time. Maybe he did go crazy, or maybe he was always a manipulator. The rumors of him being a cold-blooded outlaw, then seeing his interactions with John for the first time, practically solidifying the 2 main points. Dutch is charismatic, he seems to be pretty charming, and he's a maniac that lost his damn mind.
Now let her go. It's over. You want the girl, John? You always were the romantic sort. You know, gentlemen, this man here, oh, he married a whore. Used to ride with us. We all had her. Oh, but he married her. And you know that makes him a better man than us. He's a better man. Have the girl, John.
Easy, Dutch.
She's a parting gift from me.
That is how he is essentially seen throughout the first game. It's not until the second game, when he's younger, and we get a glimpse of how he was as a leader, at a time in his life when he wasn't seen as quote-unquote crazy. There's a lot to be desired about certain parts of his upbringing and what his entire criminal rap sheet looks like, but we do see a lot more of him, enough to be teased and left to wonder if he was always a bad guy, and his mask of working towards a just and righteous philosophy he could rally people around was slowly slipping as the game progressed. And then we have the other hand, where we are equally left to wonder if it was the opposite, and we just saw a good guy go so far off the rails his paranoia, personal frustration, and ambition led to him caring for only himself, all too willing to turn on those he raised, those he would refer to as his sons, his family.
Be well. I had fun with you today. I was gonna say you're like a son to me. But you're more than that.
With this video, I'm not trying to go into what would the next Red Dead Redemption game look like. I'm not trying to speculate on what the next installment would even entail, how it will come to fruition, or what the story and that game's characters will be. What I want to do is ask you a simple question, and that is, do you think Dutch has become such a massive entity tied to these games that he would have to have some kind of presence in the next game? Has he become such a complicated personality that any future outlaw, gunslinger, or lawman that turns out to be the antagonist or some latent issue for us in the next installment just completely pales by comparison, and we can't help but yearn for the return of Dutch? Or even a small inkling of what kind of noise he's making during the next game's events. This is of course assuming if it takes place while Dutch is still alive and the Van Der Linde gang is slowly making a name for themselves. But I'll give you an example of what I mean here, of a series that has accidentally created a villain so weirdly loved and hated that he has made some kind of appearance in, I believe, every single entry into the series after his death in the game he was first introduced in, including a couple spin-off games that I'm not even entirely sure are considered canon to the story of everything. But the villain I'm talking about is Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2. This guy, on paper, is fucking crazy. Handsome Jack has allowed human experimentation. He has killed countless of people. He's killed innocent people out of his own paranoia in a desperate attempt to keep his own power. He enslaved his daughter and forced her to use her powers to achieve his own ambitions. Yet, in a weird twist of fate, even though he enslaved his own daughter, he still loved her to death. And even though Handsome Jack was doing all these countless atrocities, he still believed he was the hero. Jack was so well liked and so well hated at the same time. In the next Borderlands game, in the pre-sequel, it's all about his rise to power. They even included a character where you can play as Jack's doppelganger, so you get to deal with even more of Jack's personality and his own twisted backstory. In Borderlands 3, there's recordings that are tied to Jack's backstory, and he's not even in the game. And the first DLC of that game is completely devoted to just Handsome Jack. And if you never played any of the Borderlands games, it's worth noting, these games are not really known for their story. That's more going on in the background. That is just a means to the end. The main purpose of the games are the gameplay. The Borderlands games are looter shooters, and the main lore of Borderlands specifically, as a looter shooter, are the countless variations on the weapons that you can find. But even then, Jack was written so well that every villain you come across just pales in comparison. He set the bar so damn high that even if you are faced with a good villain that is well written, you can't help but compare to the person that's left such a massive impact on the game's universe. And I think Dutch toes that line very well. He's still likable in both games. Even in this first interaction between Dutch and John in the first game, there's that tension. You can already tell John has the fullest intentions of at least bringing Dutch in, which he's already aware that he's probably going to have to kill him. Dutch, on the other hand, just decides to toy with him. He says hello to John, asks how Jack is and Abigail, then he flips the script by calling John an errand boy. That has always been a ladies' man, a true gentleman, as he married Abigail. Someone who, well, let's just say, didn't exactly have a reputation for staying faithful.
Oh, he married a whore.
Rockstar's proven to be extremely talented in character development, and while the GTA games aren't as narratively fleshed out compared to the Red Dead Redemption games, at least comparing Grand Theft Auto 4 and 5 to Red Dead Redemption 2, to be fair, we can also blame that on the span of time with Red Dead Redemption 2 having more resources and of course the technological leap behind its development, on top of just how advanced and ambitious games happen to be over the course of time. So who knows, technically, Grand Theft Auto 6 could be much more narratively driven than even Red Dead Redemption 2. But as the two series stand, with multiple entries in Grand Theft Auto and different stories, different protagonists, different personalities, people have latched on to different people. Some people prefer CJ, others prefer Franklin or Trevor or Michael or even Tommy, and a huge chunk prefer Nico. It's possible for them to not fall into this pitfall of accidentally tying the series strictly to just Dutch, or making Dutch such an interesting character with his own outlaw philosophy on stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, swearing off revenge or killing innocent people, all while doing just that, and portraying it as something that is absolutely necessary for the gang, everybody else's well-being. As it stands right now, it looks as if a good chunk of people kind of see these games as nothing more than just an account of Dutch's life, albeit through the eyes of another and not his own, which I think a lot of people would agree is not really the point of these games. Dutch is a great character, with just enough known about him to let the mind wonder, giving credence to him being a genuine person and lending more interest behind his actions and the genuine reasons behind why he does them. I love Dutch. He's a very complicated character that is hard to see not returning, but at the same time, it's a character that doesn't really define the series. And it's with that being said, I want to pass this off to you. What do you think about Dutch? What do you think about his position in the series as a whole? From the 2 games we have now to any other future installments into the Red Dead Redemption series. Do you think that he's such a well-written character that he's practically expected, and that it would really be that difficult for Rockstar to come up with someone to challenge or rival the level of interest that so many people have taken in him since his first debut in the original game? Let's talk down in the comment section below. But like always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Without horses, we cannot hunt. Without hunting, we will starve. This is another act of war.
I see that.
Men have helped me before, and I have money.
Put your money away, son. What do you think, Charles?
You know I told your father I will not fight over some horses.
But I made no such promise. Come along.
When it comes to the manipulation of Dutch Van Der Linde, a group of people that possibly suffer the most are the Native Americans. It's quite obvious Dutch takes advantage of them in both Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2. In the original Red Dead Redemption, we caught glimpses of it, primarily from the perspective of just Dutch being crazy and finding another group of outcasts to serve him. I think when it came to that game, the most interesting angle of all that we got was that of the scholar McDougal's.
So, I understand we have a mutual interest in Mr. Van Der Linde? You gonna kill him too? Kill him? Good God, no! What is it with you people out here? No, Van Der Linde fascinates me. A white man living among natives. A civilized mind turned savage. It's reverse integration or regressive acculturation. I don't know. I haven't found a name I like yet.
A white man fraternizing and living amongst the savage natives. It gives insight to the mentality and prevailing perception towards the natives and how those who sympathize with them or treated them any more kindly than was socially acceptable at the time are seen as being brainwashed or tricked by the lesser people that these natives are. Granted, how we see Dutch and his relationship with the natives in the first game is severely limited. Dutch's screen time and interaction with John only happens a handful of times, and any hope of piecing together how he and the natives began working together against the common enemy that is a civilized world, for the most part, was really open to speculation. Our main source of information and peek into that world and that relationship between Dutch and the natives was from Nastas. And even then, it's pretty cut and dry. All he says is that Dutch takes advantage of the natives that are already angry, upset, brooding over the position that they're in, and the submission towards the United States Army, towards the United States government, towards the law.
Van Der Linde has attracted a following of young men on the reservation. They are turning to bad things.
So fine, we have a wanted outlaw that would rather be made a martyr before allowing himself to be captured alive. And he's hiding out in the mountains with the local natives that are all too willing to abandon their docile ways of life to continue to fight against a system that not only continues to take advantage of them and their people, but time and again go back on their word. Well, I think the background of having natives continuing to fight out in the woods and hills either alongside or for a wanted outlaw is very interesting. There really isn't much expanded on the natives in the first game. Their main purpose is really to explain where and how Dutch has such a vast number of men still willing to fight and die for him. I don't want to mislead and say that was his only source of manpower, because that's not the case. Through the gameplay, it looks like there's bandits and other outlaws, other misfits that are drafted among Dutch's ranks, but for the most part, the natives seem to be that untapped potential that he's dialed into. It's not until the second game that we get a better idea of the clever way Dutch could have attracted this following in the first. If we go back to the final chapter of the main story, Beaver Hollow, the chapter where not only is the wedge amongst the Van Der Linde gang members near its breaking point, many members are leaving, and those who have stuck around are either with Dutch and Micah, or really with Arthur and John, which, with Arthur and John, is more so the camp of self-preservation if anything. During this chapter, Dutch is referred to as being more and more unhinged, quick to lose his temper and even quicker to take a life. Dutch during this time has adopted a policy of anything is good as long as that means creating a bunch of smoke and noise. Smoke and noise meaning any type of distractions that can mislead any type of law enforcement, the Pinkertons, or the army off of the Van Der Linde gang's tail.
Then Tahiti, the Fiji Islands, or this place, New Guinea, dancing girls, freedom. But first we have to make a whole lot of smoke, a whole lot of commotion.
It's while adopting this policy and scouting the possibility of robbing a train carrying supplies for the United States Army that the ultimate blessing was handed to him. This blessing was the burning hatred of Eagle Flies, son of Rainsfall, the chief of the Wapiti Indian tribe. The situation of the Wapitis, and consequently the relationship between Rainsfall and his son Eagle Flies, has been a very delicate one to say the least. The Wapitis have been moved multiple times already, and after it's been discovered there's oil underneath the current reservation that they're living on, there's rumors that they're getting prepared to be moved yet again. In order to expedite this process or to ensure that the Wapitis are moved, a commander in the United States Army named Colonel Favors has created a culture within the nearby Army division. A culture that promotes and possibly even rewards any type of actions taken against the Wapitis that would anger them and incite some sort of conflict between the natives and the United States Army. This in turn will not only make it easier for Favors to justify any wrongdoing he has committed intentionally against the natives, such as stealing their horses, removing their ability to feed themselves, shipping the young and women off of the reservation, destroying sacred sites to further anger the natives and incite violence, and possibly the worst offender of all, deliberately withholding medication from the Native Americans. Many of them are sick, many are dying, and the few that remain are split between peace and listening to their chief Rainsfall, while the other demand war. A war Rainsfall is well aware they won't be able to win. So while there is an ongoing split between father and son, the young that crave bloodshed versus the old that just want to keep their values and traditions alive, values and traditions that can only have any kind of hope of continuing on to further generations if war or direct conflict between the Wapitis and army could be avoided. Dutch finds in the middle of this entire situation a group of people that he can easily manipulate and take advantage of to his benefit. Arthur pretty much immediately identifies this and calls Dutch out on it, to which Dutch slyly responds by repeating the gang's old motto.
Why are you getting involved in this, Dutch?
You know me. We shoot fellers as need shooting. We save fellers as need saving. Feed them as need feeding.
Not this again. It's been quite a while since we helped anyone but ourselves, and even you know that.
I do want to point out that from this first mission where Dutch decides to get involved with the Wapiti situation, pushing Eagle Flies into more and more bold action, Arthur pretty much instantly identifies what Dutch is up to, and even tries to level with him during the opening stages of A Rage Unleashed, and again during Favorite Sons, where Dutch is right by Eagle Flies' side when they both confronted what they believed was going to be a small military patrol, with the intentions of humiliating them by covering them in tar and feathers, which they naively hoped would draw attention off the Van Der Linde gang and equally dishearten the army to continue its recent actions against the Wapitis.
What are y'all doing?
An eye for an eye. We didn't start this, Arthur. They did.
We? This ain't our fight.
It surely is.
Whatever it is you're planning, it ain't a good idea. They want you to fight.
Nobody will be killed.
We're just gonna trap a few of them in the valley, disarm them, tar and feather them, and remind them to leave these boys alone.
You have energy for prank?
I mean, just saying that out loud, it sounds like a horrible idea. Colonel Favors and his recruits based out of Fort Wallace would only seem to be hardened in their resistance and lack of sympathy towards these natives, should this little prank be conducted on them. But Eagle Flies, being far too young and frankly too obsessed over his own anger and rage towards the army, trying to right the wrongs his people have been forced to suffer through by way of brute force, cannot see what Dutch is doing. Considering Dutch has spent some quality time with Eagle Flies and hearing how Dutch tried to casually get Arthur to agree and see how him getting involved with the Wapiti situation is him attempting to save these group of people that they need saving when he is clearly precipitating their doom, and he knows he's sending them off towards their doom. He's completely condemning these people, and he openly admits it himself just moments later to Arthur in the same mission.
Besides, it's perfect. People will see these boys. They won't notice us, and they'll think we're gone. Everyone will blame everything on the Indian problem, and we'll disappear up the river. But first we need to trap them in this pass. Help me dynamite up these trees.
So, you're using them?
No, sir. No. Never. But it is mutually beneficial to draw attention to one problem and a veil over another.
These are good people, but their situation is real complex. We ain't helping them.
Sure we are. Come on, let's get this done.
If you go back and just rewatch those two specific clips with Dutch justifying his actions with Arthur in front of Eagle Flies during a Rage Unleashed when they're going to retrieve the stolen horses back, Dutch aligns his actions similar to those of Eagle Flies. Here's a group of unfortunate people being beaten down by the United States Army, being taken advantage of by the system, being abused, disrespected, and made a mockery of. And in order to get Arthur aboard, hey, it makes sense to align those with what the gang's values and overall vision is. And then during the mission Favored Sons, where he levels a little bit more with Arthur, it's difficult to really tell whether if he was just trying to get Arthur to understand that, hey, I am kind of using them, and then gauging Arthur's response, because a few seconds later he says we are helping them. You know, he goes back and forth with these reasons as to why he's doing what he's doing, why he's getting involved, why he's so committed to helping quote-unquote Eagle Flies, the Wapitis, for empowering the younger generation of these Indians that are watching their elders and their old pacified chief Rainsfall just be taken advantage of. Eagle Flies himself says that his father has confused wisdom with weakness, and that's a perspective alone that Dutch completely capitalized on. It makes you wonder exactly how far Dutch was willing to go to ensure his ends, his goals, his needs, and wants were realized regardless of who suffered, or how many times he got someone else from the Van Der Linde gang to see what he was trying to get them to see, abandoning any reservations they may have had on a potential job or lead as long as the group's motto was dangled in front of them. This is their creed, this is their philosophy. If you can help someone in accordance to that, then why not continue on with it? I don't want to turn this too much into speaking about the Van Der Linde gang at large, or if Dutch was really always like this, and now we get the most brutal version of how he has always seen other people that weren't part of his own ranks or of his own vision, or whether if this is just what Dutch has become in his desperation and his gang being a former shell of what it used to be. But knowing this early on, damn near immediately from the start, that Dutch fully intended to use the natives as human shields of sorts is possibly one of the more brutal things he's done. And to add a little more fuel to the fire, Dutch was always speaking in a way that lit the fire in Eagle Flies' belly. He does admit to having some amount of responsibility in Eagle Flies' attack on the oil refinery, saying that it was his idea.
Why the hell would they attack the oil fields?
What do you mean? It's perfect.
This was your idea?
Hardly. The army, the government, the industrialists. They've taken everything from these people. Wouldn't you want to fight back?
You've handed them a death sentence.
By putting the government, the army, and the industrialists into a single target, that being the oil refinery here, it would give him the sufficient amount of smoke and noise he was really after. Especially coming off the heels of blowing the bridge, rescuing Eagle Flies straight from Fort Wallace, even though I don't recall that actually being something Dutch wanted or signed off on. And then of course the attack during the Favored Sons, where there was full-on cannon fire involved and way more military personnel than either Dutch or Eagle Flies himself anticipated. But it just goes to show that during this entire time, in an effort to gain a little bit of money, to throw a little bit of dirt, or in Dutch's words, smoke and noise into the eyes of those that could possibly come after him, he was more than willing to sacrifice an entire group of people. After the attack on the oil refinery, the Wapiti Indians had no choice but to pack up and completely move to a different country. They relocated up to Canada. And while Dutch's overall situation or position in terms of gang and manpower and those serving with or for him are completely different from the first game to the second game, it gives a little bit more of insight of how he's more than willing and more than capable of aligning his personal interests with those of someone else that he can benefit off of. So while not really seeing that dynamic directly in the first game, or the relationship between the Native Americans or the outlaws that are just misfits in the first game and how Dutch basically rounded them all up, it's not too difficult to understand how Dutch was able to do that, to make them be able to see from his point of view, from his perspective, and possibly even see it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. But let me know what you think. What's your take on Dutch's manipulation of the Native Americans? I didn't want to speak specifically about the Wapitis. I think the Wapiti situation as a whole is very complex, especially since if you go back and rewatch all those clips, Arthur is a giant thorn in Dutch's side when it comes to whatever Dutch is trying to accomplish. His plan essentially is just to burn the Wapiti Indians and to move on. And Arthur, alongside Charles, is trying to do the complete opposite. They're constantly going over to Rainsfall and trying to see in what way they can help him and help try to calm down his son to avoid a catastrophe. Really, the overall Wapiti situation is very interesting because I think we see the most character development when it comes to Charles, and then we see more of the dynamic between Dutch and of course the Native Americans, but also Dutch and Arthur. And that last mission of My Last Boy, where they all descend on the refinery, you see that moment where Charles and Sadie decide to really stay by Arthur's side. Even John runs down with Dutch, and that's not really anything particularly towards John. I think it's just more of a testament of where Sadie and Charles's loyalty, or more than anything, Sadie's loyalty lies. Let's talk down in the comments section. Like always, thank you so much for watching, and of course, I got some upcoming Red Dead Redemption videos, as well as some other stuff that's not really related to that topic or that game. So either way, feel free to hit that subscribe button if you like what you see here, or if you have any suggestions, recommendations that you want to see covered next, by all means, please share that down below. But until next time, I'll see you all later.